So what you are about to hear is a different kind of episode of Unsupervised Thinking. We got a group of people together in a room and we just had a more informal discussion. So you'll hear lots of microphone passing and there's some uneven audio, which we apologize for. But the biggest difference is that we don't have any reading materials that we all read. But we do bring up a lot of kind of random topics that we allude to without explaining in a lot of detail. So rather than link to our reading materials on the website, which is what I normally do, I tried to collect a lot of links to different resources on the various topics that we bring up, including some of our own past episodes. So if you want to know more about anything that we talk about in this episode, just go to unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. Thanks. Hello and welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast on neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. This is our holiday extravaganza episode. We have a large group of, I guess, all computational neuroscientists, but we're going to talk about, in the spirit of the Christmas Carol and New Year's, the past, present, and future of neuroscience. So let's get started. The first question that we're going to have everybody answer is just introduce yourself, say your name, and talk about how you got interested in neuroscience and or computational neuroscience.
Okay, so hi, I'm Yann. So my background was in physics, I guess, like almost like the three of you as well. No, two of you, I don't know. My background is in physics. I did theoretical physics in Dublin, and then I guess since then I kind of got interested. Well, actually, it's the same kind of thing as Connor. I got the last year of the physics course, we did like a sort of complex systems thing, and there was also a small module in mathematical neuroscience. But I was more interested in general, like complex systems, and I wasn't really interested in the brain at all. Like as a thing, like how do we understand the brain, this kind of thing. I was more interested in like ants, and like those kind of like, emergent properties of things. But all I knew was that we had also done a course in neuroscience and there was like emergent properties of the brain or something. So I kind of applied to lots of PhD programs.
So like when you were thinking about ants and other kinds of and other kinds of complex systems, like what were the things that were actually kind of motivating you in the background? Like you say you got interested in them, but like more specifically, what kind of like questions about those complex systems were interesting to you?
Basically, how simple can the individual unit's behavior be to still have like interesting behavior on the macro scale? That's like the thing so like we also had a course where like we had to do Conway's Game of Life, and I thought that was like the coolest thing, just like playing around with the parameters there and like seeing how complicated like it could look, but knowing that the real was actually very simple. That's kind of like what was the hook for me, I think, in terms of that kind of stuff. Yeah. And so then I applied for different PhD programs. One of them was neuroscience. I chose that mainly because there's a lot of traveling around on the thing. And then only like after a good solid year of like being bombarded with stuff about like, cognitive things that I actually get interested in. Like, okay, maybe like I actually thought this cognitive stuff was bullshit for like a good year. And then I was like, maybe, okay, maybe there's something to it. And I thought about more. So that's my longish answer, I guess. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Connor. I went to college with Yann actually, in Ireland, Trinity, in Dublin, and I also did this mathematical neuroscience course with a guy there. And yeah, I didn't have good intellectual reasons the way Yann did. I didn't know what to do when I finished college. So he was the reason I worked with him mainly is because he was the nicest professor in the mathematics department. He was funny and young and friendly and interesting. And then I went to Germany to do some physics-y neuroscience stuff in Göttingen. And then I think that's when I actually kind of got into it properly. Because it seemed like something that you could do kind of interesting. You could do in an interesting kind of physicsy way, but it was a bit more creative and less like stilted than a lot of the physicsy things that people like Connor were doing at the time. Connor is the guy I was working with in Trinity.
Hi, I'm Josh. I think partly what got me into neuroscience probably had something very early on, at least initially, to do with religion. I think when I was rather young, I was interested in kind of the sort of stereotypical meaning of life kinds of questions, like what happens when you die, and why do you think, and what is the nature of the soul, and after, I was also sort of generally scientifically inclined, and I think at some point it seemed natural to ask questions about like the nature of the soul through the lens of science. And the only way I could coherently formulate this question, not really so much about consciousness per se in the sort of in the more like modern sense of it, but just sort of what is the structure of how humans come to be sort of thinking beings. And so this was not a concrete foray into neuroscience, but I think most of my getting into neuroscience wasn't through like the sort of very detailed science. I think it was mostly the sort of philosophical motivation coming from the background. And I think just before I went to college, when I was maybe deciding between more cognitive routes, more kind of computer sciencey approaches, but all kind of with this sort of what is the nature of thought kind of question in the background. I was exposed to ideas about like cognitive augmentation and things like this. Like, so how could we augment people's memory using things? Eric Kandel actually wrote an autobiography upon receiving the Nobel Prize, and there's a pitch at the end of it for a company that I think he was then associated with that did like nootropic drugs for improving memory and things like this. It seemed to me at the time that neuroscience and neuroscientists were coming to understand a lot about how the brain works. So at the time that I was, suggestible and deciding what I wanted to do with my life, that there was a sort of confluence of interest in how people could figure out how the brain worked in a detailed way, and the sort of potential for that to shed some light on the sort of deeper philosophical questions. And that was at least what started me in the direction of neuroscience.
I'm Alex. So my background's in math, applied math specifically, and I really wasn't interested in neuroscience until second or third year of my PhD, to be honest. So I started working for my PhD supervisor because he did a very interesting mix of like dynamics and stochastics to study computational neuroscience. And I guess the way I got into neuroscience, honestly, is a lot of by like peer pressure. Like I kind of had to learn neuroscience in order to be in that group and in order for people to take me seriously. And then the more I learned about it, very slowly, the more I became interested in it. But it was a hard turnover because the math world is so different.
Did you think that it was like bullshitty at the beginning? Was there that initial response?
Yeah, absolutely. Like nothing's really well defined or precise, and people use different definitions for everything and like different terminology, and it wasn't very elegant or beautiful. It was frustrating. But then, I was also like very much like I thought very much like a pure mathematician. Like I was a very kind of Platonist person, and now I'm much more converted into an empiricist. So I do not. Now I really like neuroscience, and I don't think it's bullshit. That was a joke. It wasn't like a joke, but
I don't feel any clearer now.
Hi, I'm Ryan. I'm not a neuroscientist myself, but I studied with a lot of the folk that you've been listening to so far, and they've gotten me terribly interested in neuroscience. I think that one of the most thrilling aspects of neuroscience, and this may not come off as very deep, is that a lot of it is boundary breaking in the way that we look at the world. So with a lot of the other areas of physics that we study, people can reassess the way that they look at the world and still keep a framework for the definitions that they use and the concepts that they have around the background tasks. But much like when there was a lot of discussion around whether evolution made any sense, and then in more recent times theoretical physics, quantum physics, and so on, neuroscience is an area that we can actively look into and ask questions like, oh, this concept I had of what learning means, I need to completely reassess it, and I can't just assume my fundamentals. It really makes you, I don't want to say disillusioned with philosophy, but it really makes you question fundamental ideas that you have in your head that you think might be simple. And it's a great area of study just so that you can get over some preconceptions and not automatically jump to that's bullshit because that doesn't feel true or something like that. So neuroscience is really eye-opening, and apart from the fact that the subject itself requires a lot of honesty when you approach it, simply finding out from the learnings and chatting to other neuroscientists is a great way, I think, to sharpen up your critical thinking. Pretty impressive.
Just to add to that, I actually, now that you mentioned that, I would agree that one of the only times that I remember really like being kind of awestruck by a fact in a lecture was, during the first year first grad year, like principles of neuroscience stuff, where like, in theoretical physics you're used to the idea that there are like these, weird things that are happening, but that's like, it's talked about from a very early stage, I think, in secondary school maybe. And like everyone's kind of used to the idea that quantum's weird, but like I never really thought that the brain could be so like counterintuitive until you get like all this split. Yeah, it's very easy to like surprise people with facts about the brain, I think.
So what fact was it that surprised you?
I was trying to think of it, and I think it might have been the split. Alex, that's like the split brain one, whereas like. I can't. Maybe you should describe it.
Yeah, Michael Gazzaniga did some split brain experiments where they cut the corpus callosum and then they present different stimuli to either the right or left visual field, and then the patient has to report. And this is how they I think they came up with the idea that like one side of the brain is more for like language, and the other hemisphere is more for creativity or drawing or something because of these experiments.
I am Grace, and I got into neuroscience. I got interested in it in high school. I was interested in psychology because I thought understanding humans is like important and fascinating. But I think I thought that psychology was kind of like descriptive and not like it wasn't satisfying because it didn't give mechanisms a lot of the time. It was just like describing how people are and documenting behaviors. And so I remember thinking like, I want to know the biological underpinnings of psychology. So I think I like Googled or like I thought that the word I wanted was biopsychology, but that's like not used. So then I found out that what I wanted was neuroscience. And so then I did my undergrad in neuroscience, but kind of the same thing happened again. I found that a lot of the neuroscience experiments, like I was doing like really pure kind of wet lab experimental biological neuroscience. I was working in a lab that was studying addiction and another one that studied depression and that kind of thing. And I found that a lot of the neuroscience that was being done, again, just felt like describing like these neurons do this when the animal is doing that. And it wasn't satisfying the mechanistic desire that I thought that neuroscience would satisfy. And then I stumbled on computational neuroscience and like modeling of neural circuits and actually kind of taking a more formal approach. And then that felt more like a mechanistic understanding to me. Like you could actually say like these neurons connect to those neurons, and when you activate these, they activate those, and then that leads to this. And like it was more mechanism. So I think I'm just like always pushing for more and more mechanism in the understanding ultimately of human behavior. So that is all of our pasts. I think that that's a decent sampling of people in computational neuroscience and how they come to it, because there are a lot of people that come from pure math and physics. That's kind of how the field got started, and now they let neuroscientists into it, So then the next question, which is the present, is what do you think neuroscience as a field of study is lacking at this moment? What is it lacking or what is it doing well? But I am more interested in the lacking side.
I'll start with an easy one and maybe a cheap shot, which is statistics and reproducibility. I mean, that's something that seems to be a really big problem in all of the like biological and biomedical fields right now. There are different classes of problem. One of them is not having enough samples for statistical power. That like feeds in a lot with problems with like ethics, like how many animals should you like kill and like expense of those animals, and especially if you're doing primate research, that's a lot more complicated. Then there are other factors like doing statistics incorrectly, and I'm not like trying to point fingers at anyone because it is really hard to do those, and because I'm a mathematician and I joined an experimental lab, and they all seem to think I knew all this stuff about statistics, and I had to like kind of secretly learn because I'm not a statistician. I think it would be great if there were more like staff scientist positions for statisticians within big labs or within like the nature journals, for example, to help biologists who don't have a really good understanding of which statistical tests to perform. So there's that, which I think that always like gets swept under the rug. And then the other problem is just having an intrinsic biases in what is rewarded in science. So for example, you find something that's really counterintuitive and shocking and you publish it in Nature, but then it's not going to be as high risk, high reward if you just reproduce that study in the same animal in a different condition or different task or different animals or different brain regions. So it seems like there are a lot of different facts that are just kind of floating around. And first of all, it's not. Sorry, do you have a?
I mean, I kind of, as you say this, I'm thinking it almost seems like there's an incentivization of breadth rather than depth in a certain way. Maybe is that related to what you're thinking?
Yeah, that's true. But then also that's definitely part of it. But then also the fact that that Nature is, or like these journals that you need in order to become a successful scientist, you need publications in like Nature and Science, and they're specifically looking for things that are like paradigm shifts or that are surprising that you wouldn't have otherwise suspected. It's largely biasing towards finding false positives, and this is not my idea. This comes from very like a famous paper called why all biomedical research is wrong or something was, and then there was another one in Nature with a slightly less provocative title.
So I'm gonna start with the easier one, which is what is neuroscience doing well, and I would say that to me it's quite clear that I guess just the techniques that are being developed in terms of imaging techniques and large scale brain recording techniques. The ability to just record from tens of thousands of neurons simultaneously now in different brain regions as an animal is, as a mouse generally is like behaving, and then to like at the same time optogenetically target a mouse so that you can, in a way influence its sort of decision-making process is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. So that's really cool. And the problem is that we just don't know what to do with all of this data that's coming out with it. So I think actually what's missing is like there's a lot of theory, but theory that marries well with the sort of data that's being gathered is kind of missing. I think the theory that there's like lots of cognitive theories and there's lots of I think there's quite a, like Grace, you talked about mechanistic theories. There are quite a few mechanistic theories, but I think we don't know how to really properly connect the mechanistic theories to the sort of larger scale kind of cognitive theories. And I think actually, funnily enough, like, the Human Brain Project, for example, that's not really going in the right direction. That's just focusing on the mechanism still. We need to put a lot more effort into bridging those two things, in my opinion.
I think this gets at the kind of question of just levels somehow, which I think is interesting when you look at other kinds of complex systems, like social systems too. Just somehow we have the ability to, and I've been hearing when people say this like all the time ever since I started talking to neuroscientists, getting into neuroscience at all, which is that we have descriptions at various different levels. So like, detailed descriptions of the biophysics of cells and how individual neurons produce action potentials, for example. And then there are also like, psychological level kind of descriptions of certain, usually relatively simple psychological processes. And then you could even go further afield and you could talk about like more kind of, you could like, you go to like kind of the psychoanalysis kind of domain, that way of thinking about like how human beings work, like, or even like the kind of things that motivated Josh to get interested in neuroscience, like really kind of out there questions about how individuals work and what they are. And then we have various descriptions of intermediate sort of levels, but we don't have much like really convincing bridging of these levels, how they kind of feed into one another. And I think that's like the thing I would most like to see happen in neuroscience, is like descriptions of how kind of laws or dynamics or tendencies at different levels interact with each other.
Do you agree, if you really believe in emergent properties, then it may not be possible to bridge these levels in a meaningful way? And so I think that complicates it quite a bit.
I'd like you to elaborate on what exactly that means, but like, an example that I think of recently is just like, and this is kind of, I mean, well, I guess this is kind of related to some things that are actually happening in neuroscience, but just like, there's a way in which, if you talk about, like, I find a lot of neuroscientists, when they talk about human beings, there is this kind of reductionist, kind of uber biological bias. I'm not saying this is like prevalent or dominant, but I feel it's often there. Like if you're trying to investigate depression, I mean, in a way that's like, using the tools of neuroscience, the most advanced tools are going to be kind of molecular level tools, and you're kind of looking for drugs and you're looking to target receptors. So it's all very like molecular. But like clearly depression, for example, is to some extent a rather like complex, potentially, social kind of disease or illness. But I don't like, I find frustrating both impulses, like the kind of almost humanities impulse that says, like talking about receptors or whatever is like, you're making us like mice and that's like evil somehow, and we're all completely social. But I also really don't like the other one that says like we can be explained from the bottom up or something. So like I kind of like the idea of like, I mean, no one would ever actually say that, but again, a lot of these things, they're kind of like tendencies or biases that you feel exist in the background. Like no one would ever explicitly say that. I mean, some weird people would, but sometimes when people get famous, they start saying what they've actually been thinking all along, right? So what I mean is, you could have something along the lines of like, maybe there are kind of social processes that are best or most easily described at the social level of causation that kind of give rise to something like depression, but then that probably kind of has effects that maybe get down to the molecular level, and then those effects put you in a new state such that your social interactions like actually just affect you differently. These are the kinds of things I had in mind. I don't know if that relates to what you said.
Yeah, I think it depends on what definition you had in mind, Alex, for emergent properties. I feel like I don't believe in emergent properties in the way that they're talked about a lot of time. I believe in like the thing that Connor just described, where like there are these large scale social things that then impact your brain at various levels, and then your brain impacts how you engage socially. And it's complicated, but it should all be able to be explained. You should be able to say why the changes in these neurons leads to changes in behavior. Like just because it's complicated and there's multiple levels of description involved doesn't mean that they can't be connected. They kind of have to be connected for science to be able to study this kind of stuff.
I guess I wasn't thinking about these things like depression. That I think that's a really interesting point. I was more thinking about the theory of complex systems, where an emergent property. So there's like soft and hard emergent properties, and so like a more soft emergent property would be like temperature, which is you have like a bunch of moving particles and the microstate, and then it's hard to infer the temperature based on that. And then there's like hard emergence, which would say that there are some properties that you actually cannot infer from like the reductionist point of view. And this is something that's studied in complex systems in physics, and I'm not the most up to date on that, but I think that's still an active area of research. But I think what that implies is that for neuroscience is that I don't necessarily think it's bad that there are different levels of studying neuroscience, and I just don't think it's obvious that you could connect them.
That was really interesting. Is there that you know of? Is there any area where there is a currently majority belief or something that what's being studied is a hard emergent property?
I don't know. I talked to a physicist once about this over some beers, so maybe I'm misunderstanding, but he was saying that there's some paper describing a hard emergent property in an infinite Ising system, but that this doesn't exist in a finite system. So I'm not sure that I really believe in hard emergence in like a realistic setting.
What is it again? Like what is the reductionist point of view? Is it like if you measured if you measured all of the if you just had a list of all of the like properties of each element, you somehow wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, that's exactly it. People argue still about whether that really exists or not.
What does it even mean theoretically? Like I think I don't quite have a clear sense of what it is, even in an imaginary way.
Is that part of the problem, though? That like if it's not clear that this exists, it's not clear that it's defined even in a very thorough way.
I'm about to do some semantic magic here. Is it possible that the hard problem of consciousness is in fact a hard emergent property?
I think that would satisfy a lot of people who don't understand a lot of things about either of those topics. Does anyone want to say more on emergence and levels, or answer the question of what neuroscience is doing well or lacking?
So kind of going back a bit to the task of bringing, bridging the gap between levels. Do you think that this is maybe a question actually. Do you think like that the direction that the sort of mouse neuroscience or this kind of stuff like that is very heavily involved with developing new technologies is going in the right way for bridging these gaps? Because I have a feeling that it might be going in the wrong way. Basically, the move seems to be going towards like standardizing these very simple experiments where there's like a two forced alternative choice thing, and you have to like record as many as neurons as possible as the mouse is making a fairly simple decision. It doesn't seem to be attacking the sort of psychology of it, really, I guess.
So I think like there's a thing where it's really easy to just first of all get a bit lost in terms of where we actually kind of are, and then so in the sense that like I think there's so much that's been done and that we kind of take for granted in the literature that's like simple and stuff, that just the kind of like it relates to what Alex was saying about reproducibility and stuff as well. Just the exercise of like doing simple tasks while imaging loads of neurons and doing it with like lots of different mice in like slightly different settings, or like these kinds of things that some of these that there are some kind of initiatives to do. I think that will be like actually more revealing than you might think, and so in a way I think this like levels thing is in one sense like a little bit like it's just further off, but at the same time I do also think that like I think like a thing that's interesting now is like AI research and the way that's been picking up recently. I think that's cool because it starts to kind of fill in just conceptually a little bit more of what might be in the middle, kind of these kinds of, they're not like psychological level descriptions, and they're not really like uber low level. They're kind of like middle level computational algorithmic ideas, and I wonder if maybe that's going to be a source of like just ideas, like even so there could be a thing where we just don't even have good ideas and maybe they can start.
So I mean, picking up with that and kind of returning to Alex's question and also throwing my own 2 cents in for the like the present state of neuroscience, I think one thing that, I mean, neuroscience has, I think, as Yann pointed out, done a very good job of starting to build the kinds of tools and instruments to record from, observe much of the brain at the same time of animals while they behave. And this, like, is going to be very useful. I think, like, sort of in the near term, the questions about what to do with those tools, like which kinds of experiments to do, is sort of a hard one. And what I'd like to see, I think, is a move towards more naturalistic experiments, right? Rather than like overly simplified settings. We want to see more naturalistic experiments where the complexity of the experiment demands that the brain be kind of utilized in a more full way, so that you can see a realistic portrait of what the brain is doing during sort of, let's say, complex behavior. And I think, getting to Connor's point, partly historically, we didn't even have models of any sort which could, like, if you took the mouse outside of a very simple task, we didn't even know what math or what model or what kind of algorithm should be used to solve that task, the slightly more complicated tasks beyond. I mean, we didn't even know what it like would vaguely look like. I mean, kind of keeping this in mind, it feels like there are some things that are coming together. Some of the AI work and more contemporary computer science, I hope, should provide sort of algorithmic insights into how to solve tasks of increasing complexity. We can put animals into increasingly complicated settings while simultaneously recording much of their behavior and much of their neural activity. And I don't know, like, I mean, I think this is a cool opportunity. I don't know where this exactly is going, but kind of at the present, it seems like we're in a pretty good position to sort of begin seeing some benefits in the both in the sort of mechanistic and descriptive animal neuroscience literature. And so this is a cool place, I think, actually.
I'm kind of inspired by AI in a more vague, abstract way, in the sense that, like, a lot of the advances in artificial intelligence have come from ideas that existed before, but scaled up to kind of comically large numbers, like based on what people thought beforehand. So, like, just really just like being insanely not risky, but just like trying something that seems silly in the amount, like the amount that it's scaled up compared to what was done in the past. And that has led to some kind of breakthrough where like in recent years, kind of like the floodgates have opened and like a bunch of new things are being explored in the realm of artificial intelligence. And I think neuroscience needs something like that. There needs to be some sort of like crazy thing that some group does that like proves a concept that a bunch of people jump on. But I don't know that in neuroscience it's just the scaling up. I don't know if just doing recordings of more neurons at once will lead to the kind of thing that just scaling up an AI led to. And maybe it is the task complexity that needs to be scaled up to kind of absurd numbers. Like maybe just like let an animal live its normal life and just like try to understand it. Because people don't try that in neuroscience. They don't try to understand a truly freely behaving animal in natural settings. So maybe it's something that seems crazy like that needs to be done. Because I feel like there's a lot of areas in like neuroscience. It's exciting and things are developing and methods are developing, but it's kind of in a rut at the same time, from my perspective. You were first.
The one brief follow-up that I would say for naturalism and related to this is like, what would you do as a computational model to understand a naturalistic setting? So if you have an animal that you're monitoring both neurally and behaviorally, like the sort of, I think, most obvious thing to build of that is like a model of the whole animal. So like if you have a mouse or something, trying to build a synthetic mouse that behaves kind of almost exactly like a normal mouse. I mean, this is kind of the constructive process that I would see kind of analogous to what AI attempts to do or something like this in the brain. Not building it so that it solves like any productive tasks. Like, so it's an engineering problem sort of, but it's not an engineering problem in the standard sense.
Yeah, and I think related to that is I think you see people starting to do this now, like speaking of like ideas that have been knocking around for a long time, but that could be scaled up and maybe be informative. It's just quantifying behavior. I mean, in more serious ways. So there's lots and lots of history of doing that in like ethology, and also then in kind of psychophysics, And I think more just using modern computational techniques and like recent kind of advances in computing and in AI and machine learning and stuff, to just, you know, take movies of loads and loads of animals doing some simple tasks, like even just walking around, but also maybe like doing foraging or something like that. I think there's probably going to be lots of interesting things that come out of that. People are already doing that kind of thing now.
I think I take a bit more of a pessimistic view about scaling up. And the reason is, so comparing the fields of AI and neuroscience, I think are kind of opposite. Where in AI, like the theory was pretty much understood in the 80s, and it was just a matter of actually having the computational power and the ability to scale up to much larger numbers, where in neuroscience it's the opposite. So now we're starting to get the ability to record from huge populations of neurons, but we don't have any theory behind it that's linking it. So it's not clear to me that scaling up is going to make things easier, and I think it's probably just going to make things more complex, but not necessarily in a bad way.
I'm going to take this opportunity then to move on to our final question, since we're like going towards the future direction anyways. So you can answer either where would the field be ideally in 20 years, or where do you actually think it will be in 20 years? And so I think Alex's answer is will be in the same place.
No, I'm not actually. I think neuroscience is doing okay. I'm pretty optimistic. The things that I think that are more problematic in neuroscience are problems with like reproducibility, which is why I brought that up, or maybe like having too many papers that are not studied well enough to be like super, you know, super like rigorous. But that's because maybe I'm a bit of an idealist and I believe in like the slow march of progress of science in kind of like a Kuhnian way. But I think, you know, I don't know. We'll figure something out.
So let me try and throw a curveball on this one. With the future of neuroscience, I'd be interested in asking what you guys think about the approachability of neuroscience from outside of the field, from the general public. So some questions that I have would, for instance, with a background in physics, somebody starts finding proofs for Bell's inequality. Nobody in the public is going to care. It can't affect them directly. With neuroscience, however, there's things that affect our understanding. There's results that come out that almost immediately have impacts in the way that we approach, for instance, AI that was asked about earlier. And the general public don't seem to have that insight, or they're relying on magazine that says digital pig created or something stupid like that. And they seem very relevant to the average person. I feel that popular power could boost funding and can boost interest in research, can turn around the way a lot of existing scientific infrastructure needs to work for the fact that people are interested. Sadly, I would say, to the questions you just asked, I know that if I went to Average Joe and talked about AI, they'd have a huge spiel about how it's going to take all our jobs and life is going to be awful. But if I told them that we were studying a pig for AI, they'd go, why a pig? That's not intelligent. What's that got to do with AI? I mean, that's the level of dissonance.
Yeah, so I'll answer the question that Chris asked, but I'll also touch on your point, which is that, so I think, so was it 20 years? Sure, yeah, I don't know. Probably what will happen is, like Alex said, there will be like this slow march where like we'll start to sweep up like most of the mechanistic things is what's happening once we like standardize everything and like turn into more of like a proper science, basically, in the way that maybe like genetics is already done or something, where, you know, we really begin to understand what the low level, how the low level cognitive processes happen, and we're still developing theories for like, we'd probably have gotten like a little bit closer to consciousness, but I think that people, by then it'll start, you know, turning into even more semantics, because that's just, anyway, I'll probably get into, I'm getting sidetracked here. Anyway, so to get to Ryan's point, I think where I would like to see it be in 20 years is actually addressing how we can build a healthy society, basically. And I think that's one of the sciences where we can actually address that question in a genuine way. And so, but I just don't see that happening there's no noise from within the neuroscience community as to like, can we actually talk to the public about this kind of stuff? Can we actually tell them something meaningful about like how communities should form? Like how? So there was this. What was it? The mouse farm, mouse city, rat park. I'm not sure if you guys have talked about rat park. Basically showing that like, if you take an addicted mouse and you put it in isolation, it would be very, very hard to treat its addiction. It'll just, keep on taking cocaine or whatever it's addicted to. If you put it in a very healthy environment with lots of running wheels and this kind of stuff, then it actually basically treats itself and it cures itself from its addiction, just because it really wants social interaction. And I think like these are the kind of studies that would be very useful to society. It might not be very interesting from neuroscience point of view, but like that's kind of our job, is to like provide this kind of information.
So 20 years, I really agree with Alex and others who have sort of hinted at this, which is that like I think there are pretty serious structural problems with lots of, especially academic science now. I think this has come up like in other episodes, kind of maybe several times. And I think those are not trivial. Like they're not just kind of like nothing's perfect. Like there's you can start to see kind of like a fairly systematic issues of reproducibility, breadth over depth, kind of lack of systematicity, and then you see sort of attempts to address them. People are clearly aware of these things, but it's questionable whether those attempts are kind of really going along the right lines. Like, so Yann mentioned the Human Brain Project. So there are these big, programs that are supposed to kind of organize neuroscience research, but the ways in which they actually tend to do it don't really seem to address the underlying issues. It's more just like throw lots of money at a thing without really altering any of the structures of the research. Alex mentioned, like having kind of staff scientists and stuff. I think there's like probably any scientist, any neuroscientist could give you a list of like dozens of things that they would like to change, and I don't see where that change will actually come from. These kind of academic systems tend to reproduce themselves. The people who succeed in them don't really have strong incentives to go about changing them. And I do think that, I don't know, it's speculative, but I kind of think that will hinder certain things. I'll say something optimistic in a minute.
One thing, part of what I was saying previously is that maybe we'll want to try to go to more complex, more naturalistic tasks for more complex behavior. I think there are like very meaningful technical challenges that accompany that. It starts being the case that it's hard for one PhD student in a few years to go from learning the techniques to carrying out a very complex experiment, not supported by like an infrastructural system that enables very complicated experiments and more concerted effort on the same basically projects by multiple people over time. And this is getting into some of this. And I guess part of what I'm hopeful for, and I think it's realistic, and I think probably for neuroscience to succeed, something like this will have to happen, is a greater incentive structurally for engineering work to be done that is in the aid of neuroscience. I don't know exactly what this will look like in the context of neuroscience, but I mean, you can imagine if you want to do things like build a whole mouse while simultaneously studying complex mouse behavior in naturalistic environments while recording all of the neurons in some way of the brain or something like this, which like those experimental things seem somewhat feasible on a plausible horizon, but actually like coordinating the efforts of the human beings to simultaneously do all of the very different kinds of work with different kinds of incentives, and keeping those people who are able to do contributing work to that project, like in neuroscience, rather than leaving due to job advancement related reasons or something like this. I don't know. So I'm hopeful that neuroscience finds a way to solve some of those human labor related things, mostly to me about engineering, that will do this. And maybe I don't know structurally how this could change. I mean, you can imagine if companies exist that find, and this gets kind of to Ryan's point as well, like so far most of neuroscience, with the exception of a little bit of a very certain type of neuroscience in the pharmaceutical industry, most of neuroscience is not like doesn't play nice with like making money under capitalism. So it isn't clear, with a few exceptions, that while there's lots of work going into neuroscience, that there's been like something that like reaps like social benefit in a way that like allows for it to keep funding itself. Like, you know, computer science is now well funded because there's lots of things that people benefit from financially by using computers and by figuring out new algorithms and things like this. Neuroscience, maybe in the next 20 years, will get to the point, I think, where there will be like commercial successes. That will have, I think that could have some weird consequences as to biasing what kind of research gets done, but it could have, at least in certain regions, benefits of there being like real engineering staff permanently committed to certain kinds of projects. So I don't think that that's like categorically a good thing, you know, if it happens just that way. But I think that could bring some money into it in a way that institutionalizes certain like professions within neuroscience that are not just being a professor or being a grad student. And I don't want to be like too comprehensive, but that's one possibility that I see.
Yeah, so I think there's been a theme of like more structure and more, I guess as Yann would say, like making it a real science, which I wouldn't have thought to describe, you know, the problem of neuroscience as it not being a real science, but I see the point there. So I think that that's all true and good, and a lot of the structural issues are not specific to neuroscience, like a lot of sciences are suffering from these problems. I think if the structural issues can get solved a little bit and there is more systematizing and more kind of agreement on how things should be studied, then there's the opportunity to synthesize different findings, where I think neuroscience has this problem of different labs do slightly different things and no one is really pulling them all together. Everyone's kind of out there on their own. And if there's more common structure in place, then maybe the findings could be synthesized and that would lead to a lot of advances. I think we need to wrap up. So Connor, this is your last chance to say something optimistic if you've thought of what that is. Otherwise...
I have something optimistic to say on behalf of Connor, because I know he feels this way. For all those of you at home who know a statistician or have a statistician in your family, take care of them. Statisticians are for life, not just for Christmas.
And with that, we'll wrap up. So thank you all for doing this, and we'll see you next time. Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast, give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.